you all. In the last year or so, a change in my own life has been that I find myself quite often standing just here on this spot, making an introduction. I've learned to like the task. I've learned to learn from it. You have the responsibility to think about another. You think about the shape of a career, even the integrity of a life. This is good. It's bracing. It teaches humility and curiosity. But only once in all the introductions you give can you say, this is the one you wanted most, the speaker you were most intent to have in this room. Try saying it twice, and no one will believe you again. So this is the one, Stefan Collini, the one that matters more to me, because he matters more to us. Professor Collini is at University of Cambridge as Professor of English Literature and Intellectual History. I followed his books and articles from the very start and through each reach and turn. Let me remind you of some of the indispensable works. Absent Minds, Intellectuals in Britain. Public Moralists, Political Thought and Intellectual Life, 1850-1930. Matthew Arnold, A Critical Portrait. English Pasts, Essays in History and Culture. And then recently, What Are Universities For? All his books are concerned with the many dimensions of our cultural past and their life through time, the history and vocation of the intellectual life, the task of criticism, the mind in public. I don't want to embarrass Stefan Collini. Well, yes, I do. Embarrassment is good for the academic soul. And because he brings an embarrassment of riches to us, why not make him red in the face through praise that is deeply felt and long sustained? Do you ever get stalled in your writing? Do you ever feel you need the stir of a quick rhythm and a brisk thought to bring you back to writing life? I do. And I often turn to Professor Collini's sentences to revive. They mark the place where prose rhythm meets the speed and force of ideas. He runs long distances, and he laughs heartily. He resists the heavy weight of government in order to remind us of what universities can be for. And he writes that prose of his, barbed and forgiving, clever and kind, savage and soothing. Prose that matters so much because of his dauntless commitment to the work of the humanities and the life of universities. Because in the teeth of strong official winds, Stefan Collini never stops talking back. Take this passage from the new book, where he's speaking of our need to recognize that not everyone looks at the university with skeptical eyes. Not the audience he often meets, including those who may not have been to universities, but who want the chance for their children. They are, he writes, susceptible to the romance of ideas and the power of beauty. They want to learn about far-off times and faraway worlds. They expect to hear language used more inventively, more exactly, more evocatively than it normally is in their workaday world. They want to know that somewhere human understanding is being pressed to its limits, unconstrained by immediate practical outcomes. It's a pleasure to have the occasion to read such words, and then a pleasure still keener and higher to have Professor Collini speak his own words in his own voice here today, inventive, exact, and evocative. Please welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michael. By your test of embarrassment, my soul is hugely improved. I hadn't realized the fabled Virginia hospitality, which I've been enjoying for 24 hours now, but I didn't realize it was going to stretch to the the experience of sitting there, listening to a speaker be introduced and feel, gosh, I'd quite like to meet this person. It's very skillfully done, thank you. I should also just explain, as you can see, that this is going to be a lecture with no PowerPoint or other visual aids, so will require concentration on your part. I say this in the face of one of my students having recently artlessly said that I didn't use these things. He said, which would give us something to think about while you're talking. Well, I don't realize that in coming to the University of Virginia to talk about the problems facing universities, I may risk to be turning to teach a whole room full of grandmothers to suck eggs. So I'd better make clear at the outset that I'm not presuming that I have any direct light to throw on more recent local events. And indeed, if coming from another country and another system, I can contribute anything at all to your reflections, I can, I think, do it best by taking a more comparative and long-term view, talking about some of the difficulties faced in common by universities across the world. And there certainly are common elements. One of the things that has been most forcefully brought home to me by the appearance of the book Michael kindly referred to about a year ago, What Are Universities For?, is that whatever the merits or otherwise of the book, people in many different countries recognize the issues it discusses as immediately applicable in their own circumstances. And I hope you may find something of relevance in these reflections today. Many of these people, of course, have been watching developments in Britain with some mixture of regret and sadness and maybe even fear. Sadness because it is a system that they once very much admired, and fear because they sense that these may be changes which will be coming to universities near them very shortly. And I think in that sense, in the last couple of years, Britain has served as something of a laboratory for these kinds of changes which governments and administrations across the world are putting or will soon be putting into place. Now, in part, that's obviously because there's some element of copycatting among governments and administrations, noticing of some measure that they think may play with advantage in their own situation. But I think it's clear that the patterns are sufficiently marked and sufficiently in sync with other social and economic developments that what we're witnessing here is not simply a matter of the policies of one group currently in power in any of these countries, but the working out of certain longer-term social and economic changes. So I want to begin by giving you a report on the story most frequently told at the moment about universities. I'm going to avoid any specific names, places, and details. This is a story which I think applies and is rehearsed across the globe, although, as you will see, it refers implicitly most often to the history of universities in the United States and in Britain, partly, of course, because those have been, in some ways, two of the most influential models. So here is a story about the recent history of universities. The years from 1945 to the mid-1970s were years of expansion in all developed societies, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, 3 decades of recovery and prosperity. And as part of this general growth, higher education and research grew at an unprecedented rate. Numbers expanded everywhere, nowhere more so, of course, as you know, than in the USA, partly prompted by the GI Bill in the first instance, but fed by the promise of social mobility for hundreds of thousands who were among the first members of their families ever to experience higher education. Moreover, governments everywhere, again, led by the USA, poured money into scientific research in ways that increased the size and expanded the role of universities in general. During these years, universities, I think you could say, retained much of their traditional status and autonomy, the status and autonomy that they had built up during the century or more when they were much smaller and much more intimately bound up with the dominant elites of their societies. From the late 19th through to the mid-20th centuries, their much more limited functions had been accorded a broadly consensual respect, but for the most part, universities had played only a relatively minor role in their societies and economies, usually well out of the public eye. From the 1940s, however, they were increasingly the object both of government policies and of public attention. But although their scale and their visibility changed during these years, years, their fundamental character remained in some respects rather little changed. Academic faculty still by and large set the tone of their institutions. The pure sciences and the humanities were still the most prestigious and institutionally dominant disciplines, and society was still respectful of universities as one of the chief homes of a traditionally conceived culture, which it was the aspiration of the historically less privileged classes to acquire. Expansion began to subject all these features of universities to pressure, but economic prosperity and a major growth of public funding in Europe, or a mix of federal, state and foundation funding in the US, meant that hard choices among the various functions of universities could, for now, be glossed over. But this, so the story goes, was only ever a temporary and unstable equilibrium. Universities were living on borrowed cultural capital as well as a soon-to-be reduced flow of actual capital. As developed societies, again led by the USA, moved from elite to mass higher education, as traditional deference to or regard for elite culture diminished, as the demand for professional training and for various vocational and applied sciences increased, and as these societies replaced the ideal of professional autonomy with that of public accountability, so it was held universities also needed to change. And from the 1980s onwards, they did change, despite the protests of academics who had mistaken the contingent good fortune of the decades after 1945 for the timeless essence of universities. In the past 30 years, which these critics are prone to think of as les 30 and glorieuses, universities have begun to modernise. Their primary role as engines of economic growth is coming to be acknowledged, and their activities are becoming more closely aligned with the needs of industry, finance and commerce. Their funding is falling in line with the principles of a market economy, with debt-conscious students seeking value for money and research users commissioning and paying for research projects. Customer satisfaction is coming to be recognised as the true test of their success in a competitive marketplace. Management has replaced administration, with a senior management team at the apex of an executive structure, and all institutions now having a properly acknowledged business plan. And internally, professional schools and vocational and biomedical disciplines are coming to have a preponderant weight commensurate with their role as the chief income-generating program. These, the story tells us, are good and necessary adaptations to the changed world of modern societies competing in a global economy. But the changes have not gone far enough. As with all other large retail enterprises, universities have to price their goods differentially according to demand. So there needs to be more variation of price among universities and among courses. Proper key performance indicators need to be used systematically throughout an organisation to measure achievement and to weed out failure. Commercial corporations need to have a larger say in what is taught, what is researched, and how these services are delivered. Tenure is an obstacle to rational management decisions about labour mobility and needs to be removed. And new technology and more intensive use of time and plant need to be embraced to accelerate throughput and reduce costs. Compared to universities of 30 years ago, many current institutions have changed almost out of recognition. But compared to the benchmark of a rigorous McKinsey organisational assessment, they are badly underperforming, carrying excessive fixed costs and an inflexible labour market, wedded to an outdated collective ethos, poor at marketing their services, and slow to adapt to technological change. More particularly, there are still large elements within universities, especially the tenured academics, especially in the humanities, who resist these changes and cling to some nostalgic ideal of the university which only ever partially suited the social conditions of the day before yesterday. Their criticisms of any of these changes in the name of some idea of the university must be exposed and disregarded as the self-interested complaining of a feather-bedded elite who simply fail to understand or want to deny the nature and pace of social and economic change in the world. In short, what is needed, as you put it in your local dialect, is more strategic dynamism. So that's the story, or at least a story. It's an influential story at present, and what's more, I think it's one with just enough evidence behind it to make it seem in some ways plausible. After all, some of what it says about the history of universities in their relations to their host societies since 1945 is true. But before I go any further, let me just remark three simple things about the presuppositions of this story. The first is that, like all quasi-determinist theories of history, this story is in a tangle about agency. Acknowledging and adapting to the specified social changes is regarded as a freely chosen rational action, but attempting in some way to resist them is self-defeating and ultimately impossible. Second, it assumes that changes in society will simply be reproduced in the same form in the university, rather than recognizing what will inevitably be a much more dialectical relationship than that. And third, this story offers no account of what might be distinctive about universities and what they do. A university in this story is regarded as a business like any other, and so subject to the same laws which govern change in all businesses. So, how might those of us who do not find this story totally compelling go about challenging it? You'll have noticed that as I narrated this brief version of the story, I increasingly employed the vocabulary of the business consultants. The vocabulary which has more and more coloured discussion of this and other topics in politics and the media. Clearly, one major step we may take towards telling a more adequate story would be to use a vocabulary appropriate to the activities being discussed. That would, secondly, involve us in some reflection about what it is that distinguishes the university from other social institutions. And, thirdly, as always, one way to counter bad, selective and tendentious history is to write better, more extended, more analytical history. In this lecture, I want to try, necessarily very briefly, to illustrate some of the benefits of pursuing all three of these strategies. And it may be that the one thing I can do here today is to give you some sense of how these issues have played out in public debate in Britain and elsewhere. And this, as I suggested at the beginning, will at least serve as one of those kinds of coming attractions trailers at the cinema, because this will soon be coming to a university near you, albeit perhaps with subtitles. Now, I don't need to tell you that there has been in Britain in the last few years an unprecedented level of public attention to the doings of, and more particularly, the funding and governance of universities, perhaps more than at any other time in their long history. And sadly, that discussion all too often seems to reduce to the following dispiriting proposition. Universities need to justify getting more money, and the way to do this is by showing that they help to make more money. And the governing assumption has been that the primary purpose of universities is to train people for employment and to make direct contributions to economic growth. That they are, in other words, little more than a cross between an employment agency and an industrial lab. I wrote my book, What a University is For, in part to try to encourage us to stand back from this narrow and parochial debate and to take a view that is both comparative and longer term. Let me just try to remove three possible misunderstandings in advance. I am not, either here or in my book, proposing some ideal or essence, some way of distinguishing supposedly real universities from institutions that don't deserve the name. I think what we need to do rather is to reflect on the very variety of types that have grown up across the world in the last couple of centuries in particular, and on the variety of their relations with their host society. Secondly, therefore, I am not proposing some story of decline, some claim that there used to be so-called real universities, but now they've been debased or destroyed. Not at all. I believe, in fact, as I've tried to make clear on several occasions, that the expansion of tertiary level education has been a great democratic gain, and it's one that I think we should continue to support. And thirdly, and I should be very emphatic about this, I am not saying that universities don't or shouldn't also serve various practical ends. They always have, and I assume they always will. Once upon a time, this meant that they principally prepared a small number of men for service in the church, later for service in the state. Once upon a later time, they helped to put a little polish on the legible social stamp of a gentleman. Later still, they helped to inculcate Christian morality and build character. They came to provide a home for the higher learning, understood as embracing a chiefly curatorial form of scholarship, and increasingly for original work in the natural sciences. By the first half of the 20th century, their chief roles were to form an elite for leadership positions in society, to cultivate original scholarship and scientific research, and to provide beacons of culture in their local communities. But they were also constantly being loaded with various practical tasks by national and local political leaders, by captains of industry, by churches, by the military, and by any number of other groups in society who were well-funded or well-meaning, rather rarely both. But however important or worthwhile these successive external tasks have been, they are not the whole story. And one way, I think, to begin to reflect on the distinctiveness of universities is to say that they have provided a partly protected space within which trying to extend and deepen human understanding has priority over any other purpose, in a way which would be madness, or at the very least disruptive, for other institutions in society even to contemplate. I'm not suggesting, I think it's unnecessary to say, I'm not suggesting that good thinking is only done or could only be done in universities, of course not. But universities are, I think, the only institutions that have grown up where pursuing such thinking for its own sake is in principle not subordinated to any other purpose. And as a result, there's been, throughout their long history, a constant tension between those practical ends which society thinks it's furthering by founding or supporting universities, and the ineluctable pull towards open-ended inquiry, which comes to shape these institutions over time. And the very open-endedness of their principal activities, which comes to legitimate forms of inquiry that may run counter to the aims of those who founded or supported them. In fact, one begins to wonder whether societies do not make a kind of Faustian pact when they set up universities, because they ask them to serve various practical purposes. But if they're to be given the intellectual freedom necessary to serve those purposes properly, they will always tend to exceed or subvert those purposes. Now, I find the internal history of universities very interesting from this point of view, because one of the lessons, I think, to be drawn from that history is that subjects which were initially introduced for broadly practical purposes go on to outlive those purposes and establish themselves as scholarly disciplines in their own right. And this is a pattern which you could repeat with many, many disciplines. For example, to start at the very beginning, it could even be said in some respects to be the story of classics. In their long journey from preparation for clerical or political office through those centuries in which they served to hallmark gentlemen, and now perhaps figure as the very epitome of the so-called useless subject. But something similar could be said about many others. History, favoured by its Victorian champions as a practical training for statesmen and administrators, but now, of course, a widely ramifying academic discipline. Or about those ranges of things such as what we call Oriental languages or anthropology, which initially had the impulse to be set up in universities from the desire to train colonial administrators and others, but which then adopt their own autonomous scholarly concerns. And maybe we see something similar at work in our own day with subjects such as, for example, social policy or education, which initially became subjects for practices within universities for very narrowly practical purposes, but which of course then developed their own disciplinary autonomy in the whole paraphernalia of theoretical debate, dedicated journals, and so on. And actually, though it's a more complicated story, I think some similar drift is evident in the history of science faculties, which were so often, both in the United States and in Britain in the 19th and early 20th centuries, established with the hope of benefiting local industry through invention or other technological advances, but which in time came to concentrate on what is now called blue skies research, inquiries, that is, driven by the intellectual logic of the discipline rather than by the imperative to address immediate practical problems. And it's this historical pattern that I think highlights one of the reasons why universities and their host societies are bound to have rather problematic relations. The pattern also, incidentally, I think brings out one of the key differences between universities and some superficially similar organisms, such as the research and development arms of big corporations or various political and pressure group think tanks. Institutions of these latter kinds pursue inquiry into a topic but usually for a particular practical purpose defined by external criteria. And if inquiry no longer serves that purpose, then it is usually quite quickly abandoned. Moreover, these sorts of institutes and labs are not interested in what we might call the second-order inquiries, things like inquiries into the boundaries of the topic, or the character of the vocabulary being employed, or the status of the knowledge produced. And one mark of an academic discipline has come to be that such second-order inquiries can never be deemed illegitimate or irrelevant in advance. And so when reflection is free to proceed without the imperative to solve a particular external practical problem, these second-order questions inevitably start to become more prominent in the work of the practitioners of the discipline. Now, I would connect this point about disciplines to a different but actually crucially related point about the history of institutions. And I will illustrate this one from the case of Britain in particular, although I think again that it's one repeated across the world. And that is the pattern whereby institutions which were set up to provide some kind of alternative to the then model of existing dominant universities come over time to adapt and adopt many of the features of those dominant models. In Britain, you certainly see this process at work, I would say, from, successively, the foundation of the early so-called civic universities in the late 19th century, or the university colleges of the early decades of the 20th, or the colleges of advanced technology in the 1950s and 60s, or the so-called new or plate glass universities of the 1960s, or in more recent decades, the former polytechnics. In all these cases, they move towards being national rather than local institutions, developing, of course, residential and social amenities along the way. They aspire to sustain research and postgraduate as well as undergraduate education, encouraging corresponding career development in their academic staff. And they aim to expand beyond the focused beginnings to support a full spectrum of academic subjects. So in this respect, I think the pattern both of disciplinary and of institutional development exhibits features of what has been called academic drift. And clearly, this is not just a matter of the self-interest or professional ambition of individual scholars or administrators, which is at work in bringing this about. There is something to do with the fundamental character of intellectual inquiry once it is, as it were, let off the leash. Now, as I say, these remarks highlight one way to think about the deep tensions present in the relations between universities and their parent societies. A set of activities whose informing logic requires open-ended inquiry and the exercise of qualitative judgment is always on a kind of collision course with the tendency of modern societies to require quantitatively measurable forms of accountability and utilitarian outcomes. To put it in a deliberately provocative way, we could say that what's most distinctive and perhaps distinctively valuable about what universities do is precisely what cannot easily be captured by the metrics societies increasingly use to measure value. One common element to many of the politically fashionable ways of making universities accountable is that well-meant attempt to demonstrate the relevance of universities' activities to society's needs of the moment. But I think we increasingly see how counterproductive this can end up being. And surely the core of the problem here lies in trying to move too quickly from the activities carried on in universities to the benefits society is said to derive from them. Versions of this mistake are evident, again to recur to British examples, are evident in the discussion about the relations between universities and local businesses, where what is increasingly recognized by the spokespersons for those businesses is that the most fruitful relationships usually arise when university departments concentrate on doing the kind of research they're good at, rather than attempting to second-guess the current and usually rather temporary needs of particular businesses and shaping their research and teaching to meet those. And it's often been pointed out in recent years that the leading employers do not necessarily want graduates who have been given some narrow training which is intended to equip them for one particular kind of job, partly because such jobs and their demands change rapidly, and such graduates tend to be too narrow in their perspective and too rigid in their thinking. employers whom I've met at several of the conferences and discussions that I've taken part in over the last few years about this, emphasize so much that from their perspective, a graduate who has profited from an intellectually rigorous and culturally extending education will serve their needs far better in the long run, and universities should not lose confidence about that. And something similar, I think, applies to the misconceived impact criterion in the assessment of research in Britain. Now here, of course, it's essential that some case should be made for the benefits society receives from scientific and scholarly research, but we have to recognise, and predicting how I would say this, that this case has to be made in the appropriate long-term form. Making it obligatory to pursue certain kinds of narrow economic impact or media uptake of the research that we do, making it obligatory to make that a priority for our research in the short term, is going to have the effect of damaging the quality and limiting the interest of that research, and thereby, I would suggest, in the end, reducing rather than increasing the benefits to society of what universities do. So in all these cases, what I'm suggesting is that the greatest benefit to society, the case we need to make about this, is that it comes from universities concentrating on doing the kinds of things that they are particularly and perhaps distinctively good at, and not trying to second-guess immediate needs in terms of company labs or apprenticeship schemes. I've noticed that it is at about this stage of the argument that the appearance is made by one of the more bizarre and exotic products of the human imagination, namely a wholly fictional place called the real world. Now, this sumptuously improbable fantasy is quite unlike the actual world that you and I live in. In the actual world that we're familiar with, there are all kinds of different people doing all kinds of different things, taking pleasure in their work, perhaps expressing themselves aesthetically, falling in love, telling themselves they have to laugh, otherwise they cry, and generally wondering what it all means and so on. But in this invented world, called the real world, it's inhabited exclusively by hard-faced robots who devote themselves single-mindedly to the task of making money. They work and then they die. Actually, in the fictional accounts of the real world that I've encountered, they don't ever seem to mention dying, perhaps because they're afraid that if they did, it might cause the robots to stop working for a bit and start expressing themselves, wondering what it means and so on. And then, of course, the real world wouldn't seem so special anymore. It would just be like the ordinary old world that we're used to. So personally, I've never been able to take this so-called real world very seriously. It seems to me obviously the brainchild of cloistered businessmen living in their ivory factories and out of touch. I think that they need to get out a bit more. But by the same token, we in universities should be cautious before claiming for universities all manner of incidental benefits and byproducts of what we do. Because I think there is a tendency for defenders of universities to want to present them as contributing to every approved moral or social good, including the promotion of quality of respect, social mobility, and general niceness. And in addition, there's a tendency, and I can see this may be a rather delicate point in a gathering such as this, that there is a tendency to present universities as naturally congruent with all approved liberal values. This seems to me a mistake, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of tactics. These days, the term elitist is used as a conclusive condemnation of any argument or position, but I think we have to recognise that universities are, in some senses, inherently elitist. It's of course true that intellectual inquiry is, in one sense, irreducibly democratic. The best arguments and the best evidence are decisive, no matter who puts them forward. But in another sense, it is unavoidably selective. Not everyone is going to be equally good at conducting the inquiry at the appropriate level. And when these values clash, the priority for universities has to be the extension of understanding, not the furthering of desirable collateral values, however uncomfortable in practical cases this position may be. And I certainly don't think that we should put all our eggs in the basket of furthering social mobility, partly because that is itself a confused notion, which often reduces to the effects of long-term prosperity or the replacement of manual labour by white-collar jobs. but also because that would be to justify the activities of universities entirely in terms of the employment patterns of graduates, precisely the kind of reductive instrumental assessment that I think we should resist. So, I'm suggesting that in articulating the case for education as a public good, we shouldn't overstate it. Many champions of higher education tend to make universities not just compatible with almost all currently approved ethical and social values, but the necessary, and even in some cases the sufficient, cause of their realization. Universities, perhaps I don't have to tell you, are not collective forms of relationship counselling. They're not extended versions of the kind of weekend in which paintballing and whitewater rafting release the inner buddy in all of us. That is not principally why we're here. We may, of course, hope that in helping to extend cultural understanding we're not narrowing human sympathies, but there may be no necessary connection in either direction. And almost all the arguments that seem to suggest that scholarship, science, or culture turn their practitioners into better people are awkwardly vulnerable to obvious counter-examples. Just think of the inhabitants of any departmental corridor. The fact that someone can make a dazzling breakthrough in the understanding of nature while at the same time behaving abominably in other aspects of life and holding absolutely deplorable political views may make us uncomfortable in some circumstances, but I think that is another form of discomfort which we in universities have to live with. We are about extending understanding wherever it leads, and not the manufacturing of right-mindedness. I think principally this is a cognitive rather than in the first instance a moral achievement, and we have to recognize that. Now, I suspect that among the public at large there is a certain recognition that intellectual inquiry of the kind that I've just sketched here is at the heart of universities, and therefore there is potentially a greater reservoir of interest in and latent appreciation of, and for us potentially support for the work of universities, than a lot of the current public discourse actually ever succeeds in tapping into. Indeed, Michael quoted very generously a passage from the book in which I tried to suggest that there are all kinds of groups in society for whom the kinds of inquiry that we think we are doing here seem to them important for the reasons that I've just given, and that they do not want to be fobbed off with some recommendation that this is what will increase the GDP or will increase productivity in their local environment, but rather that it will stretch human minds in ways that they and others and our descendants may eventually benefit from. And I think we do well to hold on to that common intuition, that universities have some purpose other than the one that drives a great many of our current practical activities. And it's certainly true that current political discourse seems to me to be surprisingly oblivious of this, and to assume that in talking on behalf of the taxpayer, it is talking on behalf of a particular kind of beady-eyed, ungenerous, low-aspiring monolith who is only concerned to restrict public expenditure. One reason why in the title of this lecture I put publics in the plural is that I think it's always helpful to remind ourselves just how various these publics are, and not allow that reduction to a monolith to take place. Obviously, I can only say this very briefly, we, I think, should acknowledge, because it's part of the same awareness on the part of our fellow citizens, that universities don't do all their tasks all that well all the time, and that in practice many universities may be underfunded or overcrowded, or in Britain overregulated, or have other failings. I'm not suggesting we try to paper over that, only that we try to make common cause with those who themselves already have the interests of universities as I've tried to just characterize them at heart. Now, I mentioned just now that public debates about universities are bedeviled by the pressure to substitute measurements of quantity for judgments of quality. And I'm sure we can all think of numerous examples of this. But the uncomfortable truth is that the prevalence of the use of key performance indicators and all the other quantitative gobbledygook of the new public management speak represents not just the imposition of the agenda of the managerial and business class, but a loss of nerve within universities as well. As I've tried to argue before, I think we should not accept that judgment is simply a matter of personal or arbitrary opinion. Judgments have to rest on reasons, and some reasons can be better than others. We all, in fact, conduct our lives on the basis of that assumption, but we sometimes seem to lose confidence in it when faced by the proposition that in public debate only that which can be measured can be considered objective. Let me take as a perhaps less obvious illustration of this tendency something to which we've all become so inured in recent years, which I think we now almost don't notice, but is another expression of the contemporary university's insecurity about its standing and function. And that is the obsession with global league tables. Now, as we know, where their supposed findings are convenient, these are readily cited for publicity and propaganda purposes. But the truth is that they are, for any serious purpose, practically worthless. On many matters, the data are not available in strictly comparable form, and the reliance on subjective and inadequate opinion surveys provides little information that is both reliable and useful. These league tables, as we know, give disproportionate weight to big science. And the resulting rankings tell us something about the level of expenditure on research projects in the sciences in the various universities, and that is often allowed to stand as the proxy for the more intractable problems involved in deciding whether one university is, in any sense that could matter, better than another. And to whom that question should matter and why is, I think, itself an interesting question. We should challenge, in particular, the glib assumption that our universities are locked in combat with each other in some form of worldwide competition, which is itself a transposition of larger assertions about the centrality of national economic competitiveness. The language used here betrays a kind of mercantilism of the intellect, a fear that the stock of national treasure will be diminished rather than augmented by the success of enterprises elsewhere. It's remarkable how quickly and how easily this language has become naturalized in the past 2 or 3 decades, even though it is damaging to the intrinsically cooperative nature of all science and scholarship. And in this way, discussions of universities, as of many other matters, has become afflicted with what, if I can make a European allusion here, we call Champions League syndrome. That's to say, it's assumed that all top universities play in the same league. I make the inverted commas intrusive to call attention to the strangeness of these, what are in effect metaphors, which have come to be part of our everyday speech about universities. Now, national and world opera obviously comes to be invested in having universities that might, for example, give the big American powerhouses, as I heard one Vice-Chancellor put it, a good game. Many of the ways in which a particular university might contribute to maintaining the standards of scholarly and scientific inquiry more generally, or the ways in which a whole system of higher education in a country might meet the needs of that host society, these are simply disregarded in league table writers. In part, of course, because there is no way of translating any possible answers to such questions into the necessary tabular and quantitative form. I mentioned in passing that it's an interesting question who wants or needs these league tables and why. After all, to whom could it seriously matter that University A in one country was ranked, say, 57th, and University B in another country was ranked, say, 96th? But the question, I think, reminds us that it's misleading to speak of the university in the singular in these cases, just as I've suggested it may be misleading to speak of the public in the singular. We always are addressing something which is, I think, more specific and more local than that, and that the form of our argumentative strategy and rhetoric may need to be tailored accordingly. Where publics are concerned, after all, these may include legislators, parents, foundation administrators, journalists, school children, donors, government officials, students, taxpayers, and so on. And any actual individual, of course, may belong to more than one of these categories. And these, I think, call sometimes for different literary and rhetorical tactics. Similarly, the cultural background and expectations for universities in different countries are, for historical good reasons, very various. And the global league tables, in a sense, try to elide or rub away these differences in a way that I think does no justice to the very good work that different kinds of university systems do for their own populations. Now, since, as you can tell, I am here in part urging some of my fellow academics to stick their heads above the parapet and try and make the case, I thought I might try and offer one or two reflections on the kinds of missiles that we may encounter in doing this. As I say, I have encountered, whatever the merits or failings of what I've tried to write in my book, I've encountered the response that there is a real hunger in a variety of publics for a better and fuller account of universities to be made by those within universities to various kinds of audiences without universities. But I have to say a small minority of the responses to what I've written in various forms have, well, shall I say, been hostile? Shall I say been condescending? Shall I say been dismissive? Shall I say been abusive? Now, this is a tricky topic for me to talk about because, of course, it may be that these people simply find something exceptionally wrong-headed and offensive about me. But I don't think that is the case. I think what we're touching on here is, again, something much more widespread. And it's worth reflecting for a moment on this kind of hostility. Part, I think, of what provokes it is for an established academic at a leading university to suggest that some contemporary political or administrative measures frustrate rather than promote the true purposes of universities. To do this is to court accusations of being superior or being dismissive of the concerns of ordinary people, are there any kind of people who aren't ordinary people, or of appearing to brandish an unmerited sense of entitlement. And in some quarters, there may be a view that academics would, by and large, do well to keep quiet on these matters, or if they do unwisely raise their voices, they should begin with an acknowledgement of their own good fortune, an apology for the failings of universities in the past, and a firm commitment to work together in the future to push beyond excellence. Well, you know how it goes. Now, in this connection, I want to try and make a point which I know risks very much being misunderstood or misreported, but I think it's a very important one, and I'm going to try. As I say, I've had, unfortunately, some experience of this kind of hostility and some occasion to reflect on its content and its tone. There is, of course, in the political sphere, in the blogosphere, in various forms of media discussion, a strain of hostility and resentment towards universities. This, in part, connects up with long histories of anti-intellectualism, something, of course, in the United States, very well chronicled by Richard Hofstadter and others, and indeed, earlier on, diagnosed brilliantly, I think, by Torsten Weber. But the narrower version of this response finds it really outrageous for academics to criticize or complain about anything to do with the society's treatment of its universities. Now, along with what may be understandable sources of these reactions, I think there may be an element, this is where I know that it risks misunderstanding, but I think an element of what Nietzsche famously called ressentiment at work here. There's a bitterness in these reactions, a combination of anger and sneering and a certain kind of levelling contempt, which seems far more than is called for by the actual disagreement over ends and language and so on. And I'm going to risk a little sally of speculative phenomenology and say that I think this reaction, for all its hostility, encodes a kind of twisted acknowledgement that there's something desirable and even enviable about the role of the scholar and the scientist. Some of it, of course, may be a resentment of the supposed security of tenure in a world with very little security of employment. And some of it may be a sense of how much autonomy, comparatively speaking, academics have in their working lives, compared to people who enjoy very little autonomy in their working life at all. And some of it, I think, is a kind of grudging acknowledgement. The matters that scholars and scientists work on are in themselves interesting, rewarding, and perhaps humanly valuable. And that perhaps anyone who gets to do that has no right to complain about whatever is done to them. Now, this coexists, of course, with a parallel conviction that academics are oblivious to or sheltered from the great determining economic necessities of life. And so they need to be given a sharp reminder of those necessities. So there's a complex emotional etiology here, I think. It seems to me that at the moment, academics are often the objects of, simultaneously, a kind of resentment and a kind of envy. Because their roles seem to allow them to deal with intrinsically rewarding matters, while being financially supported by those who are not privileged to work at first hand on these matters. I think this reaction would like to see the chill wind of necessity, that's the encompassing weather of most people's lives, blow a little more searchingly into universities. And the idea, therefore, that from this privileged and protected position, academics should then dare to complain about policies that make their activities more democratically accountable, the only way democracy at the moment understands that operation, I think that is what is felt to be simply insupportable. And I think we need to understand that reaction and do our best, in a sense, to work with it and then work around it. Now, of course, it's in the nature of all such little pieces of speculative phenomenology that I can't convince you with any further evidence if you think that is not true, but I suspect that in many areas of our experience we are familiar with the fact that a vehement negative reaction might bespeak something else involved, some implicit recognition of a quality that has, under other circumstances, something desirable or worthwhile about it. So, despite these kinds of risks, as you see, I'm suggesting that I and my fellow academics should try a little harder to make the case to various relevant publics in the variety of styles that may be called for. And for my own part, I wanted primarily to contest this narrow conception of universities as just institutes for training the workforce or applying discoveries to create economic growth. And I think if we take the long view, consider what we value and admire about good work in scholarship and science, and then reflect on the conditions which seem conducive to its achievement, we head along a better path. It may be that public discussion of universities sometimes focuses too narrowly on their teaching role, their undergraduate teaching role above all, seeing them perhaps as bigger, more sophisticated versions of high schools. Obviously, this role is absolutely central to most universities, but it's not the whole story. Universities are complex organisms which have now become a very important medium, possibly the most single important institutional medium for conserving, extending, and understanding the human heritage and passing it on to subsequent generations. And I think if we try and reflect on the conditions that are necessary for the flourishing of that function, we will not take too damaging a short-term view. Also, of course, adopting this wider perspective may help us become more aware of the limitations of treating economic growth as the overriding test of value. Taking a longer-term view of the history and the future of universities encourages us to ask fundamental questions of the goal of contributing to national economic prosperity. For example, how much prosperity do we need? And who counts as we? Is it desirable at any cost? What is it in its turn good for? And so on. And I think any serious attempt to address those questions will inevitably have to invoke non-economic values. Most people, as I've suggested, recognize the standing of such values in their own lives. They don't care for their partners or their children in order to generate a profit any more than they admire a beautiful view or a natural wonder because it increases employment. But as I've also suggested, it's become difficult to appeal to such values in a public sphere whose discourse is chiefly framed by the combination of individualism and instrumentalism. Universities aren't just good places in which to undertake such fundamental questioning, they also embody an alternative set of values in their very rationale. And one conclusion that might be drawn is that the case for universities cannot be made in appropriate terms without at the same time challenging some of these presuppositions about economic growth. I'm not suggesting, I'm not quite that quixotic, I'm not suggesting that we try to change ordinary human motivations about prosperity, nor am I suggesting that we should try to regress to some pseudo-primitive communalism in which we all grow our own shoes and weave our own loose sleeve and so on. But, as I mentioned, we do, nearly all of us, live parts of our lives in accordance with values and goals which are other than those of wealth maximizing. But we have great difficulty articulating the values that inform these common experiences, and we seem to find it nigh impossible to make these values and their articulated ideals operative in the realm of public discussion. And that's one reason why I think the task seems so daunting. An adequate case for universities can't be made simply in terms of contribution to economic prosperity, yet to try to change the terms in public discourse more widely can seem both over-ambitious and, as I said, exotic. So let me end with one very brief general reflection. If the language we use to talk about universities represents them as being principally institutions that provide narrow vocational training for employment and the application of technology to promoting economic growth, and if the language we use about students represents them as being customers who shop in the educational supermarket purely for what provides the most remunerative future jobs at the lowest cost, then those are the kinds of universities and the kind of education we shall end up with. It's very important, I think, that we should try to articulate a different and more adequate conception of what, in a sense, universities are for, because otherwise we risk damaging or even in some cases destroying the defining characteristics of universities and what has made them so valuable to humanity in the search for fuller and deeper understanding. Attending to this idea may help remind us, even amid distracting circumstances, that we are indeed merely custodians for the present generation of a complex intellectual inheritance which we did not create and which it's not ours to destroy. Thank you. Michael, beforehand, that one part of these occasions I particularly find interesting and enjoyable is question and answer. Some of you may have other things you have to go to, so please do, but I would very much welcome questions, comments, objections, complaints from all of you.
I appreciated your encouragement to change the discourse, and I'd love to give you a common example and ask for your help in solving it. What are you going to do with that nature? One response could be, well, you should just study it for its own sake. That's the right thing to do. That's kind of the smug academic response. The other is to say, oh, well, with that degree, your writing ability would enable you to be a good investment banker, and have the economic response. Is there a third way to help change the discourse to answer the very common, what are you going to do with that nature?
Okay. Well, one thing I would just say is that your way of not, I think, framing, your way of quoting the question, takes two very extreme possibilities. You're either doing it for its own sake or you're becoming an investment banker. Now, I think there's a little room between them here. One of the things that I should just say is, I think, surprising when this question gets going, as you reply quite rightly, it so often does, is that the majority of those who speak in some official positions in society outside universities are people who did majors which were not in any direct sense vocational. I mean, we are by and large, certainly this has been true in Britain, but in certain areas of American life, I know, and I'll talk to people, is true as well, we are to a very large extent governed by those who had a liberal education in the arts and sciences. They may have gone on to do other things as well, but that remains, I think, true. And one of the things we can do, I think, is not just emphasize the variety and plurality of activities, and let's, after all, recognize that if anyone reads into becoming an investment banker some kind of demonizing because practical associated with barracudas and so on, we don't have to do that. We could talk about someone who goes to teach in an inner city school. We could talk about someone who runs a non-profit organization. I mean, there are all kinds of practical outcomes where the skills and forms of understanding which we hope we have encouraged in students in the disciplines that we teach will enable them to perform their tasks much better. I think that is true. But the other thing that I would say is that it's often helpful to get a discussion like this away from the individualism of an particular case. That's to say, as a society as a whole, we have a very strong interest in things like the level of cultural awareness, the forms in our media and in our public life of discussion, the attitude towards preservation of natural environment and of human heritage, the use of and decisions about medical and technological inventions and so on. We have a very strong interest collectively in maintaining the best informed, most sophisticated, and most rigorously expressed public debate about these issues. And having people who are critical readers, having people who have some perspective on this, who are not always the ones making the decisions, but are very often they're in some sense interlocutors at some level of these organizations or of these media or finally of the political process, I think is another of the reasons why we want that to continue. So I agree that that's a rather high-minded argument to wheel out in the living room to the parent who's fixing you the beady eye that you were imitating there. But I think for us to tell ourselves the story about it, it's a part of the story. And we should, I think, not lose confidence in that larger part as well as in the more immediate use and deployment. Sorry, I think you were first.
Yeah, reading part of your book, I couldn't help think of Alan Bloom and I guess before him Matthew Arnold. I was just wondering, in perhaps giving up the literary canon or in history, like the core requirements of what ought to be taught rather than sort of a plurality of disciplines, do you think do you think university has maybe lost some monolithic canon one could point to say this is what we teach in the public discourse, or do you think that's sort of?
Okay. First version of the answer, no. Second version of the answer, no, because well, first of all, I should just say that my scholarly soul cries out here to make a little distinction between Matthew Arnold and Alan Bloom. And I will, for the moment, take my distance from Alan Bloom. I'm ready to come back to Matthew Arnold in extenso, if you wish. But there seems to me in that kind of argument, first of all, a kind of cultural nostalgia, which I have no time for, frankly, and would not wish to encourage. And secondly, there's a deafness, I mean, not deft, but a lack of hearing in that argument, to the energy and variety of what all these different disciplines have achieved in the last generation or more. I mean, the last thing we want, surely, is to go back to trying to teach a certain very restrictive, often rather poorly historicized canon of books, which happened for a variety of contingent reasons to be what were the canon when some of these old men were young men. I don't think that is a way for a university, any university, to maintain any sense of what it contributes to society, any sense of relevance at all. So that's why no because, as you can tell, rather passionately, I don't think we should do that. But as you may have heard in the talk here, I do think we should be careful about moving from the position I just tried to instantiate to a certain kind of relativism about arguments and about arguments about value. Because I do think we lose confidence in those arguments quite quickly. And sometimes people think we can only have any confidence in them if we're nailed to that narrow canon which for some generations seem to be fit. I don't think that is right. We don't need to be nailed to that. But I don't think we should abandon the confidence that there are good reasons why some books are more rewarding to study than others, and that we would be willing to argue that case to skeptics and those who want to know why. Those reasons will sometimes reflect recent or contemporary social developments. And I'll just say very briefly that surely one of the things that has changed out of recognition, the way we think about a whole range of activities as well as disciplines, is the way we've become so much more aware of questions of gender in the last 3 or 4 decades. We surely would not want to try to perpetuate a way of thinking about the world which excluded those considerations, which have enriched and diversified any set of syllabuses, any set of research techniques, and so on. Instead, that would be one of the areas where we might want to say universities have explored, possibly taking the leading role in exploring, or a leading role, something which is of great relevance to contemporary society and to everyone in it. And that's not come about by adhering to some fixed or now rather narrow canon. I hope I didn't put you off by the passionate answer, but that's what I think.
I found very compelling your argument in your book that in order to enter into these debates about the value of what we do, in universities and in humanities, we first have to develop a very precise sense, a deep sense of what it is that we do. Right? And I wonder if I could press you on this claim that you made in the lecture, also in your book, that the primary achievement of the university is cognitive rather than moral. Because I think that speaks to many of the arguments that we attempt to make about the value of the university and humanities, what makes us human, for instance. And I find interesting your selection of cognitive rather than intellectual. That is very purposeful on your part. Cognitive in the United States has certain kinds of scientific overtones. I think we live in a culture in which that word is very much overused and in a reductionist way. Humanities is up against precisely the kind of quantitative, reductionist, scientific explanation of states where the word cognitive carries a lot of weight, right? MRI brain scans can explain aesthetic appreciation of art and so forth. So I find that interesting. But I also wanted to ask you whether we want to exclude what I would call the ethical dimension of education. Because one of the things that, one of those beautiful phrases that struck me in your book, in something very compelling, is when you compare the goal of the university to the museum, and you say it enables individuals to place themselves in relation to the world. Surely that's more than a cognitive achievement. It has to do with an ethos and a sense of humanity and of being human. So, as much as I am compelled by your idea of cognitive and also the distinction that you make between understanding and knowledge, for instance, I wonder if we do want to exclude the ethical.
No. Okay, no, very, very good question. One reason that I put that in both the book and the lecture is that I think the case for, in particular, the humanities, universities more generally, but particularly for the humanities in recent years, has, to my ear, often been made in slightly overheated ethical terms. It's a great deal to do with the cultivation of sympathy, largely through encountering fictional characters in small numbers of 19th century novels sometimes, but in the Greek. That account looks at, first of all, universities in terms of undergraduate education, I think a little too narrowly, and secondly, undergraduate education rather too narrowly in terms of great books, of course. What's talked about is a small number of philosophical and literary classics, and not the whole range of things, that, from archaeology to ancient languages and everything else, exact scholarship in between. And so in order to distance myself from what I think is an overemphasis of that kind, I want to try and draw our attention back to the range of things scholars in their everyday work, both as teachers but also as writers and thinkers, actually do. And a great deal of that, it seems to me, is the pursuit of more and more exact understanding of limited and specific areas of the cultures of the past, thought, whatever it might be. And one advantage, I think, of emphasizing that, not just because it's true, but also I think it helps us not fall into some old two cultures model. I think it both is the case, and I think it's in our interest to make the case, that we and our colleagues in the natural sciences have a lot in common. We have a lot in common in the future of the university, a lot is at stake, but we have a lot in common in what we actually do. And we should be very careful, I think, to erect some hard and fast methodological divide between so-called humanities and so-called sciences. So, to encompass briefly those, I fall back on the distinction there, saying it's a cognitive, not an ethical achievement. I see cognitive as it's a word that like a lot of these words, they bring baggage with them that I would perhaps rather have checked before it got into my prose. But I still think that that emphasis is the right one. Although I entirely recognise what you very, very deftly put towards the end there, that, and I try in another context to say myself, which is that one reason why what we're talking about is the expansion of understanding, rather than simply the accumulation of knowledge, is because that partly is an aspect of the capacities and qualities of the understander. It depends a great deal, as everybody in this room who's taken or given a class knows, it depends a great deal on a range of human capacities of expressiveness, of curiosity, of forcefulness, and so on. And those get refined out to some extent, leaving, as it were, a common residue of shared understanding, but they can't be entirely phased out. It is not that kind of impersonal activity. So to that extent, I entirely agree with you. There is something there about human engagement with these subjects, which might seem to be rather underrepresented or artificially narrowed by my use of the word cognitive. But I still think, overall, that to put the emphasis on what it is that we do and the ways we understand, rather than on some elevation of our moral behaviour as the outcome to this, is the right argument to pitch, and is also true to what we do.
But why cognitive rather than intellectual, I guess?
Because of wanting to emphasise the acquisition and extension of new forms of understanding. But it is actually something which has a cumulative aspect built into it. But I mean, I'm not, that's my explanation for why I used it. I'm not wedded to the term. You might persuade me if I were to get it. So I don't know who's first. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I assume most people here are extremely sympathetic to your argument. But let's assume that we win the argument, that we shift the culture away from the kind of narrow instrumentalism, etc. We don't justify education in terms of economic criteria, etc. It seems to me we still face another problem or this issue, and that's the demographic. At earlier points in time, we were putting 5, 10, 15% of the age cohort through these systems of higher education. Now the aim is, the reality is we're putting 50% or more, and the aim is to put even more. So the question is, can we keep the same rules and goals for this enormously expanded system that we had for the old system, or is there inherently, I would say there's inherently going to be some social differentiation between those? Should that in any way be formalized, or how should we deal with that and talk about that problem?
Yeah, no, I like the way you put it at the end. I think it is a question of how should we address this? Should it be formalized, or are there more? Yeah, no, I don't know either. I think it's right to come at it by thinking, should we regard this as some kind of kiss of death at one end? Should we regard this as not a problem at the other end? No, neither of those seem to be right. It's a question of how we address this is certainly very important. I mean, one thing just quickly to say that I think everyone in the United States is in a better position to respond to this than I am, is that the diversity of types of institution that you have had in this country, and including the diversity of levels of entry and re-entry from community colleges and so on to different kinds of institution, is surely part of the way to go here. And one of the things that I think is, has historically been inadequate about a lot of the major European systems, certainly the British system, is that it's a very, very poor system for second chances. By and large, people go to it at 18 or don't. Now that's changed in the way that everything else has changed in society. We should be thinking far, far more about continuing an adult education than we traditionally have. And as I say, I think American institutions perhaps have ministered to this rather better than they have in Europe. But even with that, one of the things that has struck me when I have visited places now in the British system which were called polytechnics, for those who don't know, there is no equivalent exactly, but they were a little closer to community colleges in some ways. They often took less well-qualified students from local backgrounds, often who were going initially to pursue some more immediately vocational course. And that these were made universities in the 1990s in Britain. One of the things that the people who graduate from them and people who teach in them almost universally report is that the lifting of aspirations that this brought with it has been a great benefit to them in their work and the students feel in their study. That they feel connected to a wider world of scholarship and of intellectual striving in a way that if the institution is defined from the start as only having a very practical, limited, local role, it's harder to, for that spirit to infuse the activities that are carried on there. Now, I don't think by connecting them to a larger system of universities you instantly solve the kinds of problems we're talking about, but I think it's the right way to go. One reason why I said early on in the talk that I do think there is a great democratic gain to the expansion of tertiary education in all these countries, and we should do our best to try and sustain and expand it, not to contract it, is that looked at from the point of view of the student or teacher in one of those institutions, having some at least of some of these ideals operative in their environment and to be appealed to, does, I think, enable them to do the kinds of things they do better and with better heart, and for their students to benefit more from it. It doesn't solve all the problems by any means. Of course, you very politely didn't refer to the whole question of finance of the expanded system, which we all know, brings a whole other set of problems with it. And I don't, again, pretend I've got any simple answers to that. But all I'm saying, I think, is that we should not let those problems scare us into some retreat to some wish that we could have a very small number of universities which perhaps taught a very small number of books to a very small number of people, and that would all be hunky-dory. I do not think that's the right line. I don't mean you think that's the way to go either. But I do think that in encouraging the expansion, we do not necessarily have to think of ourselves as abandoning or diluting some of the things that make that work of higher education worthwhile.
To follow on a bit about the point that came up about ethics, I wonder if the difficulty we have and why we will probably end up circling about terms like cognition, intellect, understanding, thinking, reason, is that in some ways, I think we have an impoverished experience in the last, say, 150, 200 years of what thinking can be. There was once upon a time something like moral reasoning, ethical reasoning, that was understood as such, a form of reasoning that required a particular set of tools in order to engage in it. And now, of course, it's all just opinion. And so we don't really have to train it. You have it, you don't. Well, everyone has one, of course. And so you don't have to train it. Maybe you sharpen the tools a little bit. But we don't really talk about that kind of thing as being a matter of reasoning anymore. Or even moral cognition. I'm not sure what that would mean, but I know there are psychologists working on these kinds of things. I mention this in part because I want to ask you a question. I'm about, at the end, I was about to sort of stand up and sing the last chorale of the Messiah. You're preaching to the choir. Have you ever given this talk before? Not the choir. and I ask it for this reason. I have siblings, college graduates, professional school graduates, people who read, who are very interested in these kinds of things, but these are business people. And I tell them about the unpleasantness of June, as we call it, in a very genteel Virginia way, and about the issues and how we're trying to respond and so forth. And they say, Brian, get with it. Don't you understand? The people you're trying to talk to don't want to hear that kind of stuff. They see dollars. They see the breaking of the monopoly that universities have on the access to students. They see the ability, and they are not constrained by something that we keep talking about, which is the common good, the benefit that we do to society. Thanks to Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations rather than the Moral Sentiments, they don't have to think about whether their activities engage the common good, which itself is an ethical sort of inquiry. Whereas we constantly talk about even TIA CREF, our retirement program, says for the common good. We constantly think about this, and this is perhaps one of our strengths. And yet I think we do lack the nerve, and perhaps the courage, to be able to say that, in part because we're not quite even sure how to talk about it anymore, since we have been denied the language of moral reasoning. Part of it would seem to me that, and so what my brothers say is, come on, you guys have got to start thinking strategy. Don't try to convince these people, because they're not convincible, or even if some of them are as individuals, as a group, they're not. You need to beat them at strategy, because that's the way they think about something. I'm just wondering if this resonates with you from instances in which you face audiences that are perhaps not quite ready to stand up and sing Hamlet.
I would say a gathering of British MPs at Westminster are very loath to stand up and sing, in my experience. So there's one audience I've talked to several times, and certainly a variety of publics around, as a matter of fact, with what successes I'll come on to. But I mean, yes, of course, as I have myself just said in this talk, I think we should tailor our talks for different audiences and pitch our rhetoric accordingly. So have I given this talk? No, this talk didn't exist 2 weeks ago. This is the talk for this occasion. But obviously I said similar things in other ways, and I think we have to think about what's similar and what's not. But when you talk about the people to whom these arguments are addressed and that we won't convince them, I'm actually, despite what some friends and also ill-wishers have said, I'm actually not a political optimist about the whole process as far as, for example, in Britain, current government policy is concerned. That's not going to change, in my view. People have protested, but I don't think it is going to be made to change. Certainly not made to change by lectures like this. But we have to remember, I think, that they themselves, especially if they are elected politicians or their officials, have to take into account other views as well. I'm not going to, sitting across a table, change some Minister of Education or some civil servant's view on the day. But if we all make much more persuasive and attractive a case which many more of their constituents, their readers, their newspaper editorialists and all the rest of it continue to put out them, they themselves will change, because it's in part the view of current political classes that the only argument that plays with the electorate is the argument about finance. It is in part that view that I think so narrows this, and which they're not entirely right about. And that's why I think there is some kind of chink in the room for inserting a wedge to better arguments. So I think that's very long term, and I'm not particularly an optimist about it, but I don't think we should, just because, as you rightly report, confronted with particular individuals, they're going to stamp their foot and bang their dollar signs, as it were. That doesn't mean that we're not going to make headway in some respects around them, behind them, and make them, as it were, turn around. Just very briefly about the question of arguments about common good, and whether really all we're going to do is what people think is swap opinions. As you can tell from the talk, I think quite the opposite about that. And that, again, I think, is one of these places where having a foothold in a public discussion comes as soon as the proponent of no matter how utilitarian or limited an idea starts to talk about its benefits. Because we then get into a language of what counts as benefits and for whom. We then get some leeway to talk about why these things are desirable. And it may be that they have not themselves used the vocabulary of a common good, particularly that phrase, but it may be actually they're making an appeal to something which they think is in the national interest, or is in the interest of their constituents, or whatever, for certain reasons. It's very hard to be a successful politician in the long term and not appeal to certain reasons, however tendentiously or spuriously in terms of conviction, but they are the coin of public debate. And so I think, again, if we do not simply take the view that these are merely arbitrary and subjective opinions, but these are matters about which there is some room for debate, which may be often defeated and not convince everybody all the time, but which nonetheless makes it harder for politicians and others to ignore those considerations, then I think we've made a little headway. So I'm not so pessimistic.
It strikes me that 3 times there you used the words or the phrase long term. And it strikes me that that is also something that could be quite powerful for us, to the extent that these are institutions that tend to think, perhaps in the longer term than the next financial quarter, which apart from just finance itself, it may just be the short-term nature of finance that also makes it so difficult to think in the space of 2 years or 3 years, 5, 10, or 20, or more.
Yeah.
And that if we begin to pitch arguments explicitly in the long term, and try to shift the temporal frame within which we imagine the life of universities, and societies, and institutions more generally, that perhaps we open up some ground that we, people in universities, can occupy, that is in a sense foreclosed to the people who think entirely in terms of what's happening on the next progress report.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true, but we all have to recognise, I have to recognise if someone in any such talk that I might give stands up and says, look, my department's going to be closed next month unless we come up with some better argument about the money. Well, it is going to be. I mean, I can't, nobody can. Good arguments can't necessarily stop that happening. I mean, I think being realistic about that as well is part of what we have to do. But it's certainly true, as you say, my suggestion is that we do play to the long term as our strength, and that has some benefit.
Stefan, let's make this the last question, then we'll reconstitute outside, and you're willing to keep talking, are you not?
It looks like it, doesn't it?
Well, then what I have is actually a concluding remark that bounces off both Brian's points about strategy and short and long term. This is a thank you, because a number of us in this room, chairs and deans, have been, I could say, invited or summoned to talk this week to a consulting group. We have learned that we are thought leaders.
Congratulations.
And we are to talk about the supreme student experience and the impact on society and various other things. So thank you. I was taking notes.
Let's really get that.